The conference room went silent when Alexander Kane slammed the contract onto the glass table. 7 executives flinched. The 8th, Marcus Chun, held his gaze steady, though sweat beaded at his temple. "You're asking me to believe," Alexander said, his voice cold as winter steel, "that you lost $42 million because you were distracted by a divorce." Marcus swallowed. "Sir, love." Alexander cut him off with that single word, spoken like a curse. "You let love, or the absence of it, compromise a decade of work. You let emotion override logic. You became weak." He straightened his 6'3" frame, every inch the predator in a $5,000 suit. At 34, Alexander Kane had built Kane Corp into a $15 billion empire. He owned skyscrapers in 12 countries. Politicians returned his calls. Competitors feared his name. But he'd never let anyone close enough to hurt him. Not since he was 17 and learned that love was just another word for betrayal. "You're done," Alexander said simply. "Security will escort you out." Marcus stood, shoulders sagging. "Alex, please. 20 years. 20 years of competence. 1 year of weakness. The math is simple." Alexander turned to the window overlooking Manhattan, dismissing him without another glance. The room emptied quickly. Alexander remained alone, studying his reflection in the glass. Handsome in that sharp, calculating way. Dark hair perfectly styled, blue eyes that missed nothing, a jawline that seemed carved from ambition itself. His phone buzzed. Lauren, his assistant. "Your 8 o'clock is here. Cancel it." "Sir, it's the mayor." "I said cancel it." He grabbed his coat and left, ignoring the nervous glances from employees who scattered like birds before a storm. The private elevator took him down 73 floors without stopping. His driver waited at the curb, door already open. "Home, Mr. Kane?" Alexander nodded, sinking into leather seats that cost more than most people's cars. The penthouse waited, 15,000 square feet of marble and emptiness. He'd hosted charity galas there, business dinners, strategic parties where every conversation had a purpose. But he'd never invited someone simply because he wanted them there. The thought arrived unbidden, unwelcome. Alexander pushed it away as the city blurred past his window, all light and shadow and millions of people who meant nothing to him. Power was predictable. Success was quantifiable. Love was chaos wrapped in pretty promises, and Alexander Kane had learned long ago that chaos destroyed everything it touched. He was better off alone. The morning alarm never sounded because Sophie Hart was already awake, watching dawn break through her apartment window. Not a penthouse view, just a modest 6th-floor walk-up in Queens. But the sunrise turned the neighboring buildings gold, and that was beautiful enough. She stretched, careful not to wake the orange tabby cat curled at her feet. Mr. Whiskers had appeared at her door 3 months ago, skinny and scared, and Sophie had never been good at turning away things that needed help. "Morning, troublemaker," she whispered, scratching behind his ears. He purred, a sound like contentment itself. Sophie showered quickly. The hot water only lasted about 7 minutes, and dressed in comfortable jeans and a sweater. Her job at Cornerstone Community Center didn't require power suits or designer labels. It required patience, empathy, and the ability to stretch a shoestring budget into something that actually helped people. The subway was crowded, as always. Sophie gave up her seat to an elderly woman carrying grocery bags, steadying herself against the pole as the train lurched forward. A businessman in an expensive suit glared at his phone, muttering about incompetent assistants. Sophie felt a flash of pity for whoever worked for him. She'd loved once, deeply and stupidly. Michael had been charming, ambitious, full of promises about their future together. Then he'd gotten the job offer in London and left without a backward glance. That was 4 years ago. The wound had healed, leaving only a scar and a lesson. Love yourself first, because sometimes you're all you've got. But Sophie still believed in love itself. She saw it every day, in the single mothers fighting for their kids, in the elderly couples who came to the center holding hands, in the volunteers who showed up week after week with no expectation of reward. Love wasn't weakness. It was the bravest thing humans could do. The community center smelled like coffee and hope when Sophie arrived. Her coworker, Maria, was already there, setting up chairs for the morning literacy class. "You're early," Sophie said. Maria smiled. "Big day? That corporate foundation is sending someone to evaluate our grant application. We need this funding, sophomore." Sophie's stomach tightened. They needed $60,000 to keep the after-school program running. Without it, 40 kids would have nowhere safe to go while their parents worked. "What time?" 10 o'clock. Then we better make this place shine. They spent the next 2 hours cleaning, organizing, making sure every program was visible, every success story documented. Sophie was rearranging the children's artwork when Maria grabbed her arm. "He's here." Sophie turned and felt her breath catch. The man who entered looked like he'd stepped out of a different universe. Dark suit that probably cost her monthly rent. Shoes so polished they reflected the fluorescent lights. And a face that belonged on magazine covers. Beautiful in that cold, untouchable way that made you think of marble statues. He surveyed the room with eyes that calculated and judged, missing nothing. "Mr. Kane," Maria said, nervousness making her voice too bright. "Welcome to Cornerstone. I'm Maria Rodriguez, and this is Sophie Hart, our program director." Alexander Kane's gaze landed on Sophie. She met it directly, refusing to look away first. "Ms. Hart." His voice was deep, controlled. "I'm here to evaluate your grant application. I have exactly 45 minutes. No pleasantries. No warmth. Just pure efficiency." Sophie felt something prickle at the back of her neck. Not attraction, but something sharper. Recognition, maybe, of exactly the kind of man she'd spent her life avoiding. "Then we shouldn't waste time," she said coolly. "Follow me." Alexander had expected a typical nonprofit presentation, desperation wrapped in optimism, emotional appeals disguised as data. What he got was Sophie Hart listing facts like artillery fire, each one landing with precision. "We serve 214 families," she said, walking him through the narrow hallway. 93% report improved quality of life after 6 months. Our cost per family is 37% below industry average. "Industry average is meaningless," Alexander interrupted. "It includes programs with administrative bloat." Sophie didn't miss a beat. "Our administrative costs are 11%. Would you like to see the breakdown?" He would, actually. Alexander took the offered tablet, scanning the numbers with the same intensity he'd give a corporate acquisition. The financials were clean. Almost too clean. "These numbers," he said, "they're optimistic. They're accurate. They assume perfect conditions. No unexpected expenses. No staff turnover. No life," Sophie finished. "You're right. Life happens. Last month our boiler broke. I personally went 48 hours without sleep making calls, finding a contractor who'd work within budget, and ensuring not a single program day was lost. The numbers don't show that. They don't show Maria covering 3 positions when we can't afford to hire. They don't show the volunteer who comes at 6 a.m. because she believes in what we do." Alexander studied her. Mid-20s, maybe 30. Brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. No expensive jewelry. No designer clothes. But she stood there like she owned the world, defending this shabby building with the intensity of a general protecting territory. "Belief doesn't balance budgets," he said. "No," Sophie agreed. "But it gets people through the door. And once they're here, we give them tools to change their lives. That's what the numbers represent. Real people with real transformations. Not line items on a spreadsheet." Something flickered in her dark eyes. Not desperation. Challenge. Alexander felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. Curiosity, maybe. When was the last time someone had spoken to him like this? Like he was just another person, not a billionaire who could change their life with a signature. "Show me the after-school program," he said. Sophie led him to a bright room where children were reading, doing homework, laughing. A little boy ran up to her. "Miss Sophie, I got an A on my spelling test." Her entire face transformed. "Marcus, that's amazing." She high-fived him, genuine joy radiating from every movement. The boy noticed Alexander and stopped. "Who's that?" "Someone who's deciding if we get to keep doing this," Sophie said honestly. Marcus looked up at Alexander with wide brown eyes. "Are you going to help us?" Alexander felt 40 young faces turn toward him. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, fired hundreds without hesitation, but standing there under the weight of childish hope, something uncomfortable lodged in his throat. "That depends on the numbers," he said finally. "Oh." Marcus's face fell. "Okay." He ran back to his friends. Sophie was watching Alexander with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You have 30 minutes left," she said quietly. "What else do you need to see?" What he needed was to get out of this place where emotions ran high and people looked at him like he was supposed to be someone's hero. Alexander checked his watch. "I've seen enough. You'll have our decision in 2 weeks." 2 weeks. Sophie's composure cracked slightly. "We need an answer by Friday. We have to notify families if the program's closing. Then you should have applied earlier." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but Alexander didn't take them back. He'd built an empire by maintaining control, by refusing to let anyone rush him into decisions. Sophie's expression hardened. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Kane." She turned and walked away without waiting for dismissal. No pleading, no manipulation, just cold, professional distance that somehow felt like a slap. Alexander left the building and slid into his waiting car. But as the driver pulled away, he found himself looking back at the shabby community center, at the window where Sophie stood watching him leave. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Lauren, the Cornerstone application. Fast-track the review." "Sir, that's not. I want a decision by Thursday." He hung up before she could argue and settled back into his seat. The discomfort in his chest hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. Alexander Kane didn't like complications. And Sophie Hart, with her fierce eyes and unshakable principles, felt very much like a complication. Sophie threw herself into work for the next 3 days, trying not to obsess over the funding decision. She ran programs, filed paperwork, helped Mrs. Chun practice English, taught teenagers about budgeting. Normal things. Important things. Things that didn't involve thinking about cold blue eyes and a voice that could freeze fire. Thursday afternoon, Maria burst into Sophie's tiny office. "We got it." Sophie's head snapped up. "What?" "The grant. Full amount. They're wiring it tomorrow." Maria was crying and laughing at the same time. "We're saved." Relief hit Sophie so hard she had to sit down. Oh my God. They clung to each other. Two women who'd fought so hard for this, who'd believed even when the numbers said it was impossible. The children's laughter floated in from the next room, unaware their safe space had just been secured for another year. That night, Sophie treated herself to Thai food and a glass of wine, celebrating alone in her small apartment. Mr. Whiskers purred in her lap while she read the official grant notification on her laptop. Approved by Alexander Kane himself. She stared at his signature, bold and decisive. He'd called her optimistic numbers unrealistic. He'd treated the children like statistics. He'd made her angrier than anyone had in years. But he'd also fast-tracked their application and given them everything they'd asked for. Sophie didn't understand him at all. Complex man, she told Mr. Whiskers, who didn't care about billionaires one way or another. She closed the laptop and tried to put Alexander Kane out of her mind. Their paths had crossed once. They'd never cross again. Except fate, apparently, had other plans. The coffee shop was Sophie's sanctuary every Saturday morning. She'd order a vanilla latte, grab a corner table, and lose herself in whatever novel she'd borrowed from the library. This week, it was a mystery set in Victorian London, full of fog and secrets and pleasantly predictable plot twists. She was 3 chapters in when someone cleared their throat above her. Sophie looked up and nearly dropped her book. Alexander Kane stood there in jeans, actual jeans, and a black sweater, looking somehow more dangerous without the armor of a suit. He held a coffee cup and wore an expression that suggested he was as surprised to see her as she was to see him. "Miss Hart." "Mr. Kane." Sophie's heart was doing something stupid and rapid. "I didn't expect to see you here. I live nearby." He gestured vaguely. "May I?" Was he asking to sit? Sophie blinked. "Oh, sure." He folded himself into the opposite chair with that controlled grace she remembered. For a moment, neither spoke. The coffee shop hummed around them. Conversations, laughter, the hiss of the espresso machine. "Thank you," Sophie said finally, "for the grant. You didn't have to fast-track it. Your numbers were solid. It made financial sense. Still, those kids, they're everything to us." Something crossed Alexander's face, too quick to identify. The boy who asked if I'd help. Marcus. Did he really get an A? Sophie smiled despite herself. He did. First A in his life. His mom cried. Why? The question seemed genuine. Sophie set down her book. Because Marcus has dyslexia. Because he struggled his whole 3rd grade year. Because that A means our tutoring program works. That he's not stupid like other kids said. That he has a future. She paused. Because sometimes one small victory means everything. Alexander was quiet, studying her with those calculating eyes. But there was something else there now. Curiosity, maybe. Or confusion. "You really believe that," he said. "That these programs change lives?" "I've seen it happen." Sophie met his gaze. "I know you think it's naive. That I'm optimistic to the point of delusion. But I've watched broken families heal. I've seen kids who were failing find purpose. I've witnessed transformations that can't be quantified on a spreadsheet. Everything can be quantified. Can it?" Sophie leaned forward. "Quantify hope for me. Put a number on dignity. Calculate the exact value of knowing someone believes in you when you've stopped believing in yourself. Alexander's jaw tightened. You're talking about emotions. Emotions are unreliable. They're also what make us human. They make us weak. The words came out sharp, defensive. Sophie saw the wall slam down behind his eyes and realized she'd touched something raw. Who hurt you? She asked softly. Alexander stood abruptly. I should go. Wait. But he was already moving toward the door, coffee abandoned on the table. Sophie watched him disappear into the Saturday morning crowd, and she felt that same sensation from before, recognition. Of a man who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to be free. She didn't see him again for 2 weeks. Then he showed up at the community center on a Wednesday afternoon, no appointment, no warning. I'd like to volunteer, Alexander said. Sophie, who'd been elbow-deep in art supplies with a group of 6-year-olds, nearly dropped a bottle of glue. I'm sorry, what? Volunteer. He stood in the doorway looking absurdly out of place in another perfect suit. I assume you accept volunteers. We do. But, Sophie tried to gather her scattered thoughts. Why? Does it matter? Actually, yes. We're not a tax write-off or a photo opportunity. These kids need consistency. If you're going to show up, you need to keep showing up. Alexander's expression didn't change. I keep my commitments. Sophie studied him, trying to understand this strange turn of events. A billionaire CEO wanting to volunteer at a struggling community center? It made no sense, unless he was trying to understand something, or someone. The thought sent warmth through Sophie's chest that she absolutely did not want to examine. Fine, she said, but you're changing first. There's a storage closet with extra clothes. You wear that suit around here, you'll terrify the children. 15 minutes later, Alexander emerged in jeans and a Cornerstone t-shirt that was slightly too small, stretching across shoulders that were broader than Sophie had realized. She looked away quickly. Better. Come on. She put him to work immediately, setting up tables, organizing books, helping kids with homework. Alexander approached each task with the same intensity he probably gave corporate takeovers. A little girl asked him to help with her math worksheet, and Sophie watched him explain fractions with unexpected patience. You're good at this, she said during a break. Alexander looked uncomfortable with the compliment. It's just logic. It's more than that. You're patient. You listen. Sophie tilted her head. Why are you really here? I told you. No, really. What? He was quiet for a long moment, watching the children play. I don't know, he admitted finally. I've spent 15 years building things. Making money. Winning. But watching you talk about hope and transformation, I realized I don't remember the last time I did something that mattered beyond a balance sheet. The honesty surprised Sophie. Touched her, even. Well, she said softly, you matter here. To these kids. They don't care about your money or your empire. They just care that you showed up. Something shifted in Alexander's expression. Softened, just slightly. And Sophie felt her carefully constructed defenses begin to crack. Alexander told himself he was volunteering for logical reasons. It was good for the company image. It provided perspective on the nonprofit sector. It was the efficient use of his Wednesday afternoons. All lies. The truth was Sophie Hart. The way she moved through the world with such certainty, such grace. The way she looked at him like he was just a man, not a billionaire or a CEO or anything other than Alexander. He started showing up Wednesdays and Fridays. Then Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. Sophie never commented on his increased presence, just put him to work wherever he was needed. They fell into a rhythm. Easy conversations during breaks. Shared glances when a child said something funny. And slowly, carefully, Alexander felt something thaw inside his chest. One evening, after the center closed, he found Sophie alone in her office, staring at her computer with a troubled expression. What's wrong? She looked up, startled. Oh, I thought everyone had left. I was filing paperwork. What's wrong? He asked again. Sophie sighed. Remember Mrs. Chun? The elderly woman taking English classes. Alexander nodded. He'd helped her practice pronunciation last week. Her landlord is tripling her rent. She's lived in that apartment for 30 years, but the building's been sold to developers. She can't afford it. And there's nowhere else she can go in this neighborhood. Anger flared hot in Alexander's chest. That's illegal. Actually, it's not. Rent stabilization doesn't apply to her building. Then she fights it. Gets a lawyer. With what money? Sophie's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She lives on Social Security. She has nothing. Alexander pulled out his phone. What are you doing? Sophie asked. Calling my attorney. Alexander. I can have someone review her lease by tomorrow. If there's any legal recourse, we'll find it. You can't just. Yes, he said firmly. I can. And I am. Sophie stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she stood, walked around her desk, and hugged him. Alexander froze. He couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged him. Not a business handshake or polite social embrace, but real physical contact that said you're good and I see you, and this matters. Slowly, carefully, he wrapped his arms around her. She fit perfectly against his chest, warm and solid and real. Thank you, Sophie whispered. It's just logic, he said, but his voice cracked slightly. She's being treated unfairly. The system should protect her. Sophie pulled back just enough to look at his face. They were so close Alexander could count the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. Could see the faint freckles across her nose. Could feel her breath against his skin. You're not who I thought you were, she said softly. Neither are you. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Alexander felt his careful control slipping, felt something wild and dangerous rising in his chest. Want. Need. Things he'd denied himself for so long. He stepped back abruptly. It's late. You should go home. Hurt flashed across Sophie's face before she masked it. Right? Of course. She gathered her things quickly, professionally. Alexander watched her leave and wanted to call her back. Wanted to tell her that he was terrified, that every instinct screamed at him to run, that she made him feel things he'd sworn he'd never feel again. But the words stuck in his throat, and Sophie disappeared into the night, leaving Alexander alone with the wreckage of his defenses. Sophie told herself to be careful. Alexander Kane was complicated, damaged, completely wrong for her in every logical way. But logic had nothing to do with the way her heart jumped when she saw him. Nothing to do with the warmth that flooded her chest when he smiled. Those rare, genuine smiles that transformed his entire face. Nothing to do with falling in love. Because that's what was happening. Sophie recognized it with a mixture of joy and terror. She was falling for a man who didn't believe in love, who'd built his entire life around avoiding it. They continued their careful dance, working together at the center, sharing coffee on Saturday mornings, having long conversations about everything and nothing. And through it all, Sophie felt Alexander opening. Slowly, like a flower blooming in time-lapse, petals unfurling one by one. He told her about his childhood in fragments. Absent father, mother who died when he was 12, raised by a grandfather who believed affection was weakness. Then, at 17, his first love, Charlotte. She said she loved me, Alexander said one night. They were walking through Central Park after a late dinner. The city lights turned everything golden. We'd been together 2 years. I believed her. I trusted her. Sophie didn't interrupt, just listened. Then I found out she'd been seeing my best friend for 6 months. They'd laughed about it, called me naive, stupid. His voice was flat, emotionless. I realized love was a con, a pretty lie people told to manipulate each other. So I decided never to fall for it again. That must have been so painful, Sophie said quietly. It was educational. Alexander. I'm better off alone, Sophie. I built everything I have by trusting logic over emotion, by refusing to let anyone close enough to hurt me. She stopped walking and turned to face him. You call that better? Living in that beautiful prison you've built? Never letting anyone in? Never taking the risk that makes life worth living? Risk implies potential reward justifies potential loss. With love, the math never works out. Love isn't math. Sophie's voice rose with frustration. It's messy and irrational, and sometimes it hurts like hell. But it's also joy and connection and knowing you're not alone in this world. You say you're better off? You're not. You're just safe. And safe isn't the same as happy. Alexander's jaw tightened. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You were hurt by someone who didn't deserve you. And instead of healing, you decided to never feel anything again. That's not strength. That's fear. I'm not afraid. Yes, you are. Sophie stepped closer, holding his gaze. You're terrified. And I get it. I've been hurt too. But I didn't let it turn me into stone. Maybe you should have. The words hit like a slap. Sophie felt tears sting her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Is that really what you think? Alexander looked away. I think you should go home. Fine. She turned and walked away, each step feeling like tearing off a bandage. She'd pushed too hard, asked for too much. Alexander wasn't ready. Maybe he never would be. Behind her, she heard him say her name. Quiet. Almost desperate. Sophie didn't turn around. Alexander threw himself into work with renewed intensity. 16-hour days. International calls at 3 a.m. acquisitions that required his complete focus. Anything to stop thinking about Sophie. About the hurt in her eyes. About how empty his penthouse felt now. But she haunted him anyway. He'd see couples walking hand in hand and think of her laugh. Smell vanilla coffee and remember Saturday mornings. Drive past the community center and feel something crack in his chest. Lauren noticed. "Sir, are you all right?" "Fine." "What?" "You seem distracted." Distracted. That was one word for it. Destroyed was more accurate. Because Sophie had been right about everything. He was afraid. He'd spent 17 years building walls, convincing himself he was strong when really he was just hiding. And the one person who'd made him want to be brave, he'd pushed away. 3 weeks passed. Alexander stopped volunteering at Cornerstone, avoided Sophie's coffee shop, tried to pretend those months had never happened. Then Maria called him. "Mr. Kane? It's Maria Rodriguez from Cornerstone. I'm sorry to bother you, but Sophie's in the hospital." Alexander's blood turned to ice. "What happened?" "Car accident. She's okay, just some broken ribs and a concussion, but she keeps asking for you." He was moving before Maria finished talking, grabbing his coat, shouting orders to his driver. The hospital was 20 minutes across town. They made it in 12. Sophie was asleep when he arrived, looking small and fragile in the hospital bed. Bruises darkened her cheekbone, and 4 ran into her arm. But she was breathing. Alive. Alexander sank into the chair beside her bed and buried his face in his hands. He could have lost her. Could have spent the rest of his life knowing the last thing he'd said to her was cruel and dismissive. Could have let fear rob him of the one person who made him want to be more than just successful. "You're an idiot," he whispered to himself. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Alexander's head snapped up. Sophie was awake, watching him with tired eyes and a slight smile. "You're supposed to be resting," he said, his voice rough. "You're supposed to be avoiding me." "I was. I did. For 3 weeks." He moved closer, taking her hand carefully. "Sophie, I'm so sorry. For everything I said. For pushing you away. For being exactly the coward you called me." "You're not a coward," she said softly. "You're just scared. There's a difference." "No, you were right. I've been hiding behind logic and control because it was easier than being vulnerable. Easier than risking what Charlotte did to me. But all I did was miss 17 years of actually living." Tears spilled down Sophie's cheeks. "Alexander, I'm in love with you." The words tumbled out, clumsy and desperate and completely honest. "I'm terrified and I have no idea how to do this, but I love you. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you see the best in everyone. I love how you make me want to be better, how you challenged everything I believed, how you made me feel alive for the first time since I was 17 years old." Sophie was crying harder now, but she was also smiling. "You really are an idiot. I know. I love you too." The words hit Alexander like lightning. Like grace. Like coming home after decades of wandering. He leaned forward carefully, mindful of her injuries, and kissed her. Soft and gentle and full of promise. Sophie's hand came up to cup his face, her thumb brushing away tears he hadn't realized he was crying. When they broke apart, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this. The relationship thing. I'll probably mess it up." "Probably," Sophie agreed. "I'll mess it up too. We'll argue. We'll scare each other. We'll make mistakes. Then why do it? Because love isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing each other anyway. About being brave enough to try." Alexander looked into her eyes, warm and honest and full of a faith he was just beginning to understand. And for the first time in 17 years, he let himself believe. Not in some fantasy version of love, but in this. In Sophie. In the messy, complicated, absolutely terrifying reality of opening his heart. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's be brave." Sophie smiled and pulled him close again, and Alexander felt something fundamental shift in his chest. The walls he'd built so carefully began to crumble. And underneath them, finally, was something real. Not power. Not control. Not the cold certainty he'd relied on for so long. Just love. Imperfect and risky and absolutely worth it. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the community center watching Sophie teach a group of teenagers about financial literacy. She was animated, passionate, making economics come alive in a way that would have horrified his business school professors. And he'd never seen anything more beautiful. Mr. Whisker's wound around his ankles. Somehow, Alexander had acquired a cat and a girlfriend who kept toothbrushes at his penthouse, and Saturday morning coffee traditions, and a life that looked nothing like the one he'd planned. It was better. Sophie caught his eye and grinned. He smiled back, feeling that now familiar warmth spread through his chest. After class, they walked home together through the autumn evening. Leaves crunched underfoot. The city hummed around them. And Alexander held Sophie's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "What are you thinking?" she asked. That I was wrong. About everything. That's very humble of you. Don't get used to it. He pulled her closer. But seriously, I spent so long thinking love was weakness, that caring about someone gave them power over me. But it's the opposite. Loving you makes me stronger, braver, better. Sophie stopped walking and turned to face him. You were always brave, Alexander. You built an empire from nothing. You survived things that would have destroyed most people. You just forgot that the bravest thing anyone can do is let someone in. He kissed her there on the sidewalk, not caring who saw, not caring about control or reputation or any of the things that used to matter so much. Because this mattered more. Sophie mattered more. And Alexander Kane, billionaire, CEO, man who'd sworn he'd never let anyone close, had finally learned that love wasn't the enemy. Fear was. And he was done being afraid. I love you, he said against her lips. I know, Sophie whispered back. I love you too. They walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, and Alexander realized something profound. He'd built empires without blinking, destroyed competitors without hesitation, accumulated more wealth than most people could imagine. But loving Sophie Hart, letting her love him back, was the bravest thing he'd ever done. And he'd do it again, every single day, for the rest of his life. If you enjoyed this story of transformation and second chances, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more emotional journeys. Drop a comment below telling me what moment hit you hardest. Was it the hospital confession, their first real conversation, or something else entirely? And hit that like button if you believe love is worth the risk. Because sometimes the most powerful people in the world are just trying to figure out the same thing the rest of us are. How to be brave enough